The envelope sat on the kitchen table, an ominous presence in the dimly lit room. He had found it there after coming home from another grueling day at work, expecting nothing more than the usual silence that filled the house when his wife wasn't around. The name on the legal letterhead sent a shiver down his spine: divorce papers. He swallowed hard, his fingers tracing over the embossed lettering as if touching it would change the reality staring back at him. His wife, the woman he had loved, the woman he had sacrificed for, had taken the first step to erase him from her life. Memories flooded his mind, how he had worked long hours to support her career ambitions, how he had put his own dreams on hold so she could pursue hers. The late nights, the missed opportunities, the compromises, all of it had been for their future together. And yet, here he was, being discarded as if he were nothing more than a stepping stone in her journey to success. His heart pounded with disbelief as he flipped through the documents, noting how she had laid claim to everything: the house, the savings, even the car he had bought. There was no warmth in the pages, no recognition of the years they had shared. Instead, there were cold, calculated demands. She had written him off as if he had never mattered, reducing their life together to a list of assets and liabilities. He clenched his fists, his breathing uneven. This wasn't just betrayal, this was erasure. His mind raced, trying to make sense of how they had gotten here. But deep down, he knew his wife had always been ambitious, and now she had decided that he was no longer part of the picture she was painting for herself. Their marriage had not always been this way. There was a time when she looked at him with admiration instead of disdain, when they shared dreams instead of silence. When they had first met, she was just starting her career, full of energy and hope. He had supported her, believed in her potential even before she did. He had worked overtime, taken on extra shifts, and even dipped into his savings to help fund her ambitions. Back then, it hadn't felt like a sacrifice, it had felt like love. But as the years passed and her success grew, so did the distance between them. She started making more money than him, and with that came an unspoken shift in their dynamic. At first, it was subtle. She would make offhand remarks about how he lacked ambition, how he settled too easily. Then came the comparisons, stories of her colleagues' husbands who were real go-getters, men who were making things happen. And finally, the outright humiliation, mocking his job, rolling her eyes at his opinions, treating him like an accessory rather than a partner. The warmth faded, replaced by cold indifference. She no longer sought his company, no longer cared for his input. Instead, she surrounded herself with people who shared her mindset, people who saw success as a measure of worth. He had tried to reach her, to remind her of the love they once had, but it was like speaking to a stranger. The woman he had married no longer existed, and in her place was someone who saw him as nothing more than a burden. It wasn't just at home. The way she spoke to him in public, in front of her friends and colleagues, was cutting. She would make jokes at his expense, laughing a little too hard when they asked why he wasn't as successful as she was. He could see it in their eyes, the quiet judgment, the barely concealed amusement at his expense. Once, at a dinner party, one of her friends had asked what he did for a living. Before he could answer, his wife had interjected with a smirk, "Oh, nothing worth mentioning." The group had laughed, and he had sat there, swallowing his pride along with his drink. The worst part was that she seemed to take pleasure in belittling him. When he had tried to confront her about it, she had scoffed. "It's just a joke," she had said dismissively. "Don't be so sensitive." But it wasn't just a joke. It was a pattern, a relentless erosion of his dignity. And the more he tried to hold on, the more she pushed him away, as if she resented the very idea of being tied to him. He had thought about leaving many times, But something always stopped him, the belief that maybe, just maybe, she would come to her senses. That illusion shattered completely when he saw her in court for the first time, standing tall and confident, ready to strip him of everything. She was going to take it all, their home, their savings, even his dignity. And she was going to do it with a smile on her face. The courtroom was packed. She had arrived dressed to impress, exuding the confidence of someone who had already won. Her lawyer stood beside her, a polished man with a smug expression, flipping through documents as if he were already dividing the spoils. As he took his seat, he felt the weight of 100 eyes on him, some pitying, others amused. His wife, however, didn't spare him a glance. She was too busy charming the judge, painting herself as the victim of a deadbeat husband who had leeched off her success for years. Her words cut deeper than he thought possible. She spoke of him as if he were nothing, a man who contributed nothing, who took and took but never gave. She fabricated stories of how he had been financially irresponsible, how she had carried the weight of the marriage alone. Every sentence was designed to make him appear small, insignificant. He clenched his fists beneath the table, his nails digging into his palms. When the judge asked if he had anything to say, he hesitated. He could deny her claims, argue against her accusations, but he knew it wouldn't be enough. Not yet. He needed more than words. He needed proof. And as he glanced at his lawyer, he knew they had exactly what they needed to turn the tide. The papers his lawyer slid across the table were thick, bank statements, legal documents, years of financial records that told a very different story than the one his wife had just spun. He looked at them, then back at her. For the first time in months, he saw a flicker of uncertainty cross her face. She hadn't expected him to fight back. She had thought he would roll over and accept defeat. She was about to learn just how wrong she was. The drive home from the courthouse was a blur. He gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, his knuckles turning white as he replayed the hearing over and over in his mind. The way she had smirked when the judge leaned in her favor, the way her lawyer had spoken with the kind of certainty that came from knowing they had the upper hand. It was unbearable. He had known this marriage was over long before the papers arrived, but he hadn't expected to be stripped of everything so publicly. That night, he sat at the kitchen table, the same place he had once envisioned a future with her, and stared at the pile of legal documents. His lawyer had urged him to fight, but deep down, he knew that without something truly significant, he was doomed to be another forgotten man crushed under the weight of a divorce he never saw coming. A part of him still wanted to believe there was a way out, that maybe, just maybe, she would remember who they once were. So he swallowed his pride and called her. The phone rang longer than expected, and for a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally did, her voice was sharp, impatient. "What do you want?" she snapped, as if his existence itself was an inconvenience. He hesitated, gripping the phone tighter. "Are you sure this is what you want?" His voice was steady, but there was an unmistakable edge of desperation beneath it. "We built a life together. It wasn't all bad." There was a pause on the other end before a cold, detached chuckle echoed through the receiver. "You're pathetic," she said. "You're nothing without me, and soon, the court will make that official." And just like that, she hung up. The silence that followed was deafening, and in that moment, something inside him hardened. If she wanted to destroy him, she would have to work much harder than she thought. The next morning, he met with Daniel, his closest friend and the only person who had stuck by him through the unraveling of his marriage. They sat across from each other in a quiet diner, the air thick with unspoken frustration. Daniel leaned forward, his brow furrowed, his coffee growing cold in his hands. "You're not seeing it, are you?" he muttered, shaking his head. "This isn't just about divorce. She's trying to bury you." The words hit harder than he expected, not because they were surprising, but because he had spent so much time trying to avoid admitting it to himself. He let out a breath, rubbing his temples. "I know," he admitted. "I just don't know what to do." Daniel sighed, pulling out a folder from his bag and sliding it across the table. "Then let's start with this." Warily, he opened it, his eyes scanning the pages filled with financial transactions, property records, and hidden investments, none of which were in his name. His stomach twisted. "Where did you get this?" His voice was barely above a whisper. Daniel shrugged. "A friend of mine works in asset tracking. I had a feeling she was hiding something." He clenched his jaw, the weight of realization settling in. His wife had been planning this for far longer than he had thought, quietly moving assets, ensuring that when the time came, he would be left with nothing. She hadn't just fallen out of love with him, she had systematically erased him from their life together. But now, he had something she wasn't expecting. Evidence. The courtroom was colder this time, not in temperature, but in atmosphere. His wife sat across from him, radiating confidence as her lawyer began their argument, detailing how she had selflessly carried the financial burden of their marriage while he contributed little to nothing. The judge listened attentively, nodding in what seemed to be agreement, and with each passing second, the pit in his stomach grew deeper. His lawyer leaned in, whispering, "Not yet. Let them finish digging their own grave." So he waited, let them paint him as a burden, let them twist reality into a story where he was the villain. And then, when his lawyer stood, the energy in the room shifted. With careful precision, the documents Daniel had given him were laid out on the table. One by one, his lawyer dismantled every argument his wife had made. "The defendant is accused of being financially dependent," his lawyer stated, holding up a bank statement. However, these transactions show that his earnings were funneled into joint assets, while Mrs. Carter discreetly transferred funds into offshore accounts. A murmur spread through the courtroom, and for the first time, his wife's confident expression faltered. He watched as she shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting to her lawyer, who suddenly looked less sure of himself. The judge peered over the documents, then back at her. "Mrs. Carter, do you have an explanation for this?" She opened her mouth, then closed it, for once at a loss for words. She recovered quickly, straightening her posture and fixing a well-rehearsed, wounded look on her face. "Your Honor," she began, her voice smooth but laced with false indignation. "These transactions were investments I made for the benefit of both of us. My husband was never interested in managing our finances, so I took it upon myself to ensure our security." Her lawyer nodded, seizing the moment. "Exactly, Your Honor. Our client was merely acting in the best interest of their shared future, something the defendant failed to do." But the judge didn't look convinced. If anything, there was a flicker of suspicion in his eyes. His lawyer remained calm, flipping to another page in the documents. "Then perhaps Mrs. Carter can explain why these investments were never disclosed, and why the accounts are solely under her name?" His wife's jaw tightened, and for the first time, she seemed to realize she was losing control of the narrative. The room felt heavier, the silence stretching longer as the reality of her actions began to sink in, not just for her, but for everyone watching. The courtroom wasn't on her side anymore. The judge leaned forward, his fingers interlocked as he studied her. "Mrs. Carter, these documents suggest a deliberate attempt to conceal marital assets." This is a serious accusation. Do you have proof that these transactions were made with your husband's knowledge and consent?" The question hung in the air like a loaded gun. Her mouth opened, but no words came. For the first time, she didn't have a rehearsed response, no carefully crafted lie to save her. His lawyer took the silence as an opportunity. "Your Honor, given this new evidence, we request a full financial audit of Mrs. Carter's accounts. If she truly has nothing to hide, this should not be an issue." His wife's head snapped toward her lawyer, panic flashing across her face. The judge considered the request before finally nodding. "I agree. A forensic accountant will review all financial statements before any rulings are made." The gavel came down, and just like that, her perfect facade cracked. He didn't smile, didn't celebrate. But for the first time since this nightmare began, he felt something he hadn't in a long time. Hope. The hearing adjourned for the day, but the damage had been done. As he walked past the rows of onlookers, he could hear the whispers, some filled with curiosity, others laced with pity. His wife, however, remained composed, her lips curled into a faint smirk, as if the setback was nothing more than an inconvenience. She turned to her lawyer, her voice loud enough for him to hear. "This is just a minor delay," she said, her confidence unwavering. "Once they see the numbers, they'll realize he's just desperate." The arrogance in her tone made his stomach churn, but he held his ground, refusing to react. He knew this wasn't over yet. He had seen the flicker of doubt in the judge's eyes, the unease creeping into her lawyer's expression. That was all he needed to know. Her grip on this case wasn't as strong as she wanted everyone to believe. As he stepped outside the courthouse, a few reporters loitered near the steps, sensing the tension in the air. One of them called out, "Sir, do you have any comments on today's proceedings?" He ignored them, walking past without a word, but his wife, always one to control the narrative, paused and turned to face them. "I just want what's fair," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. "I supported him for years, and now he wants to punish me for my success. But I believe the court will see the truth." She cast him a condescending glance, as if daring him to respond. He didn't take the bait. Instead, he met her gaze with unwavering resolve. Let her put on her show. Soon, the truth would speak louder than any of her lies. The next hearing began with a strategy he had expected but still found difficult to stomach, his wife painting herself as a selfless, hardworking woman who had done everything in her power to support a lazy, unmotivated husband. "I worked late nights while he sat at home doing nothing," she declared, her voice steady and convincing. "I managed our finances because he never cared enough to be responsible. I built our future while he watched from the sidelines." Her lawyer nodded along, reinforcing every word with carefully curated bank statements, ones that only showed what she wanted the court to see. To anyone unfamiliar with their history, it was a compelling argument. But he wasn't unfamiliar. And neither was his lawyer. As they listened, they remained calm, waiting for their turn to dismantle every fabricated claim. When his lawyer finally stood, he adjusted his tie and walked toward the judge with quiet confidence. "Your Honor, while my client has remained respectful throughout this process, it's time we address the misleading statements being presented here today." He then produced an entirely different set of documents, ones that showed the truth. Records of his steady income, evidence that his earnings had been used to support the household, and most importantly, proof that his wife had systematically moved assets to accounts in her name alone. The courtroom murmured as the judge flipped through the pages, his expression darkening. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "do you still stand by your previous statement that your husband never contributed financially?" His wife's face tightened, but she recovered quickly. "I was the primary earner," she said, her voice carefully measured. "That doesn't change just because he made minor contributions." Her lawyer immediately stepped in, trying to redirect the argument. "Your Honor, my client never denied that her husband made some financial contributions. But the fact remains, she was the backbone of their financial stability." His lawyer sighed audibly, shaking his head. "Your Honor, the numbers speak for themselves," he said. "Not only did Mr. Carter contribute consistently to their shared expenses, but he also made significant investments in his wife's career, investments that were never acknowledged." The judge turned to his wife's lawyer. "Do you have any evidence to counter this?" The question was simple, but the weight of it hung heavy in the air. There was a pause, a long, telling pause. Her lawyer hesitated, glancing at his client as if silently asking whether she had anything to offer. When she remained silent, his expression tightened. "Your Honor, we would like the opportunity to review these claims further before responding." It was a weak deflection, and everyone in the room knew it. The judge nodded but made a note in his file. His lawyer leaned toward him and whispered, "They're scrambling. Keep your head up, we're turning this around." If there was one thing his wife hated, it was losing control. He saw it in the stiffness of her posture, in the way she refused to meet his gaze as they walked out of the courtroom. Outside, her mask of composure cracked just enough for him to see the frustration simmering beneath. "You think you're clever, don't you?" she hissed, her voice low but venomous. "You think you can embarrass me?" He stared at her, unflinching. "I don't need to embarrass you," he said calmly. "You're doing that all on your own." The flicker of rage in her eyes told him everything he needed to know. She was cornered, and for the first time, she knew it. That night, he reviewed every document with his lawyer, making sure there were no loose ends. "She's going to try something desperate," his lawyer warned. "She knows she's losing ground, and people like her don't accept defeat easily." He nodded, already knowing it to be true. His wife had spent years crafting an image of herself as powerful and untouchable. The idea that she could actually lose this case was unthinkable to her. And when people like that started losing, they got reckless. He had to be ready for whatever she did next. The next hearing was supposed to be another round of financial scrutiny, but what no one expected was the arrival of an unexpected witness, one who had once been his wife's greatest ally. When the doors opened, a woman in a crisp blazer stepped forward, her heels clicking against the polished courtroom floor. His wife's face paled instantly, and for the first time since this case began, she looked genuinely unsettled. "Your Honor," the woman said, standing confidently before the judge, "I have information that I believe is relevant to this case." He recognized her immediately, his wife's former business partner. They had once been close, but something had changed between them in recent years. Now, it seemed, that rift had turned into full-blown betrayal. His wife's lawyer stood, clearly flustered. "Your Honor, this witness was not previously disclosed." "We request time to review." The judge raised a hand to silence him. "I will allow her to speak," he said firmly. "Proceed." The woman turned, looking directly at his wife, and what she said next sent a ripple of shock through the entire courtroom. "I'm here to expose the truth," she declared. "And I have the documents to prove it." The courtroom was silent, the weight of anticipation suffocating the air. His wife's former business partner, a woman who had once stood proudly by her side, now faced her with an expression of quiet determination. She placed a thick stack of documents on the witness stand, each page a potential weapon aimed directly at the empire his wife had built on deceit. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady and precise, "I was once a close associate of Mrs. Carter. I handled several of her financial dealings, including the accounts she claims were for the benefit of both parties. However, I have documentation proving otherwise." A hush fell over the room as she flipped to the first page, pointing to a signature that unmistakably belonged to his wife. "These transfers," she continued, tapping the page, "were made without Mr. Carter's knowledge. The funds were redirected into personal investments, separate from their joint accounts." His wife shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting between her lawyer and the judge, searching for an escape that didn't exist. Her lawyer tried to intervene, but the judge raised a hand. "I will see the evidence," he said firmly. The former business partner slid the documents forward, and as the judge reviewed them, the tension in the room deepened. The minutes stretched, and then, slowly, the judge placed the papers down, his expression unreadable. He turned to his wife, his voice calm but edged with authority. "Mrs. Carter, do you have any justification for these transactions?" She swallowed hard, visibly struggling to maintain her composure. But for the first time, she was out of words. There was no twisting this, no clever manipulation that could explain away the undeniable truth now sitting before the court. As the judge's gavel struck the podium, the weight of the moment finally sank in. The court had accepted the documents into evidence, marking a significant shift in the trial. His wife, who had once carried herself with an air of invincibility, now looked small, cornered. The murmurs in the room grew louder, a ripple of realization spreading among those who had believed her carefully crafted lies. His lawyer leaned in, his voice just above a whisper. "This is it. This is where everything changes." And he was right. The tide had turned, and for the first time in months, it was no longer his wife who dictated the course of events. Her lawyer, clearly flustered, attempted damage control. "Your Honor, we request additional time to assess these documents and respond accordingly." But the judge shook his head. "This evidence was lawfully obtained and is relevant to the case. We will proceed." The words rang through the chamber like a final verdict before the actual one had even been declared. His wife's hands curled into fists on the table, her breathing shallow. He could see it in her eyes, the realization that her carefully orchestrated plan was crumbling before her. She had built an entire life on deception, confident that no one would ever uncover the truth. But now, exposed and vulnerable, she was finally being seen for what she truly was. And she hated it. The next document presented was even more damning than the last. It wasn't just financial manipulation, it was proof of outright fraud. A paper trail showing that his wife had forged his signature on loan documents, securing additional funds without his knowledge. Gasps filled the courtroom, shock rippling through the spectators as the weight of her deceit became undeniable. The judge's expression darkened, his patience wearing thin. "Mrs. Carter," he said sternly, "this is not a matter of poor financial management. This is a legal offense. Do you deny forging these documents?" His wife opened her mouth, but no words came. Her lawyer cleared his throat, already seeing where this was heading. "Your Honor, my client was simply managing assets in what she believed to be the best interest of..." The judge cut him off with a sharp look. "That is not what I asked." The silence that followed was deafening. His wife sat frozen, her lips pressed together, her hands trembling slightly. For months, she had controlled the narrative, making herself out to be the victim, the one deserving of sympathy and reparation. But now, The truth was staring her down, and for the first time, she had no control over the outcome. He watched as she swallowed her pride, her shoulders stiff as she muttered, I know, Your Honor, I do not deny it." It was the closest thing to an admission of guilt she would ever give. And it was enough. The walls were closing in on her, and for the first time since the divorce proceedings began, his wife looked truly afraid. Her lawyer whispered frantically in her ear, his previously confident demeanor replaced by thinly veiled frustration. She had thought she could win this case through sheer arrogance, through manipulation and deceit. But reality had finally caught up with her, and now she was scrambling to find a way out. He could see the gears turning in her mind, calculating her next move. But there were no more moves left. The judge sighed, rubbing his temples before speaking. "Given the severity of these findings, we will need to reassess the division of assets and financial obligations. Additionally, the matter of fraudulent activity will be reviewed for potential legal consequences." The words sent a visible shudder through his wife's body. Legal consequences. That was something she hadn't anticipated. She had expected to humiliate him, to walk away victorious, leaving him with nothing. Instead, she was the one being scrutinized, the one facing the possibility of repercussions that extended far beyond divorce court. The power she once wielded so effortlessly was slipping through her fingers, and no amount of charm or well-rehearsed speeches could bring it back. The final blow came in the form of a simple question. His lawyer stood, his expression neutral but his words sharp. "Mrs. Carter, after reviewing the evidence, would you still claim that my client contributed nothing to this marriage?" She hesitated, her lips parting, but no sound came out. Because she knew, everyone knew, that the lie had unraveled beyond repair. She glanced toward the judge, as if searching for some form of reprieve, but there was none to be found. The courtroom waited, the tension suffocating. Slowly, she lowered her gaze, unable to meet anyone's eyes. And then, in a barely audible voice, she muttered, no, it was a single word, but it carried the weight of everything she had fought to deny. No, he had not been useless. No, he had not been a burden. No, he had not been the failure she had painted him to be. In the end, the only failure in the room was her own, the failure to maintain her perfect illusion, the failure to walk away unscathed. The judge nodded, as if he had expected as much. With that admission, we will proceed with the final review of asset division. Court is adjourned for today. The gavel struck, and just like that, the battle she had been so certain she would win was over. As the gavel's echo faded, the courtroom remained still. The once overconfident woman who had strutted into these proceedings believing she had already won now sat frozen, her carefully curated mask slipping. The judge, who had initially listened to her arguments with patience, now regarded her with something closer to disappointment. "Mrs. Carter," he began, his voice measured, "this court has been presented with compelling evidence that not only contradicts your claims but also suggests an intentional effort to deceive the court. Such behavior is not taken lightly." His wife flinched as though she had been struck, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her blazer. The weight of her actions was finally settling in. For months, she had controlled the narrative, twisting the truth to fit her version of events. But now, there was no controlling this. The judge leaned forward, folding his hands atop the bench. In light of these revelations, the court will need to re-examine the division of assets. Given the misrepresentation, your previous claims regarding financial dependency are no longer credible. She swallowed hard, her throat visibly constricting. What had started as an assured victory had turned into a slow, painful unraveling. And for the first time, she had no way to manipulate the outcome in her favor. Outside the courtroom, the shift in perception was undeniable. The same friends and acquaintances who had once praised her success, who had laughed along as she mocked her soon-to-be ex-husband, now whispered among themselves, their eyes no longer filled with admiration. It was subtle at first, averted gazes, hushed conversations that ceased the moment she walked past. But then came the outright avoidance. Women she had once called close friends turned their backs when she approached, their expressions carefully neutral, unwilling to be associated with her any longer. She had built her life around power, around the illusion of perfection. But now, that illusion had been shattered, and with it, so had the foundation of her social standing. She reached out to one of her closest friends, a woman who had always been by her side at charity events and business galas, expecting reassurance. Instead, the woman's smile was tight, forced. "I hope things work out for you," she said vaguely before excusing herself. It was clear, the moment she lost control of her narrative, she lost their support as well. And there was no betrayal more crushing than realizing the people she had surrounded herself with had never truly been loyal to her at all. As the final hearing commenced, the atmosphere in the courtroom had changed. His wife, once the confident plaintiff, now sat rigidly beside her lawyer, no longer exuding the smug arrogance she had displayed before. Her lawyer, too, seemed deflated, his previous certainty replaced with caution. The judge glanced between them before shifting his gaze to him and his lawyer. "Mr. Carter, do you have any final statements before the court proceeds with its ruling?" His lawyer nodded, standing with quiet confidence. "Your Honor, this case has revealed a fundamental truth, not only about financial deception but about the deliberate attempt to destroy my client's reputation and future. We have proven beyond doubt that the accusations made against him were not only exaggerated but entirely false. He was not the dependent, the burden, or the failure his wife portrayed him to be. In fact, he was the one who sacrificed, who supported, who remained loyal even when it was not reciprocated." His wife shifted in her seat, her nails digging into her palm, but she did not dare interrupt. The judge took in every word, his expression unreadable. His lawyer continued, "Given the fraudulent nature of this case, we request a complete reevaluation of asset distribution, ensuring fairness rather than rewarding deception." The courtroom was silent, waiting. The judge nodded once before turning to his wife and her lawyer. "Does the plaintiff have any final remarks?" There was a beat of silence, a heavy pause where his wife could have spoken, could have attempted one last desperate plea. But she didn't. She knew there was nothing left to say. The judge took his time reviewing the case files, flipping through the pages one last time before setting them down with finality. His gaze swept the room before he spoke. "This court has thoroughly examined the evidence presented, and the findings are clear. The claims made by Mrs. Carter regarding financial dependency and marital contributions have been found misleading and, in some cases, outright false. Furthermore, the attempt to conceal assets and the misrepresentation of financial records cannot be ignored." His wife remained motionless, her jaw clenched so tightly it seemed as though she might crack a tooth. The judge continued, his tone firm. "Given these circumstances, this court rules in favor of Mr. Carter. The previous financial demands made by Mrs. Carter are hereby dismissed. Additionally, due to the fraudulent nature of her actions, the court orders a reassessment of asset division, ensuring that Mr. Carter receives a fair and equitable settlement." A stunned silence fell over the courtroom, his wife's breath coming out in short, shallow gasps. This was not how it was supposed to end for her. She had expected to leave him broken, stripped of everything. Instead, she was the one losing it all. The ruling was finalized, and reality settled in. His wife sat frozen, unable to process how completely the situation had flipped. Not only had she failed to take everything from him, but she had also been forced to surrender what she had tried so hard to keep for herself. The irony was suffocating. She had spent years belittling him, calling him nothing, only to now find herself facing the consequences of her own deception. The courtroom emptied around her, the voices of spectators blending into a dull hum in the background. She had come in certain of her victory, but now, she was simply another failed manipulator who had underestimated the truth. He stood near the doors, watching her from a distance. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel anger or bitterness, only relief. She had built an empire on falsehoods, and it had finally crumbled beneath her feet. He had once loved her, had once believed in the life they were building together. But that woman, the one he had fallen in love with, had disappeared a long time ago. Now, all that remained was a woman who had lost everything in her pursuit of power. And he, despite everything, was finally free. The gavel's final strike echoed through the courtroom, sealing her fate. His wife sat motionless, staring at the judge as if hoping for some last-minute reprieve that would never come. Her carefully orchestrated plan had disintegrated before her eyes, leaving her with nothing but the wreckage of her own deception. The once proud woman who had confidently claimed she would destroy him now sat slumped in her chair, her hands trembling slightly as she processed the reality of her downfall. No lavish settlement, no financial dominance, no triumphant exit, just an empty future she had never anticipated. The murmurs of the spectators filled the room, some whispering in quiet amusement, others in disbelief at how completely she had lost. As she rose from her seat, the weight of the stairs became unbearable. Her lawyer, who had fought so hard to keep up appearances, now avoided her gaze, likely regretting ever taking her case. She turned towards the doors, her head held high in one final act of defiance, but it was a hollow display. The whispers followed her like shadows, and for the first time, she truly felt what it was like to be powerless. She had spent years making him feel small, dismissing his worth, but now, it was she who was insignificant. The moment she stepped outside, reporters swarmed her, cameras flashing, voices calling her name. She had loved attention when it had been on her terms, when she was the successful, untouchable woman at the top. But now, as the questions poured in, did you really forge financial documents? How does it feel to lose everything? She realized how quickly admiration turned to ridicule. He watched from a distance as she was engulfed by the chaos outside, her once polished image unraveling under the weight of her own lies. But unlike her, he didn't need to make a spectacle of his victory. He took a slow breath, letting the relief settle in. The battle was over, and against all odds, he had come out stronger. His lawyer clapped him on the shoulder, a satisfied smirk on his face. "I told you the truth would win," he said. And it had. Every attempt to bury him, to strip him of dignity, had ultimately backfired. She had underestimated him, believing he would remain passive, believing she could manipulate the system without consequence. But she had been wrong. As he stepped outside, the crisp air felt different, lighter. He had entered this courthouse feeling defeated, weighed down by months of humiliation and betrayal. But now, he walked away with his head high, no longer burdened by her cruelty. Reporters turned to him eager for a statement, but he simply smiled and kept walking. He had no interest in gloating, no desire to prolong the spectacle. His silence was more powerful than any words he could say. He had won, not just in court, but in reclaiming his own life. And that was all that mattered. In the days that followed, he finally allowed himself to breathe. The stress that had once consumed him, the uncertainty that had plagued every decision, was gone. For the first time in years, he could think about the future without dread. His finances, though damaged, were salvageable. He wasn't left penniless as she had intended. In fact, thanks to the court's ruling, he had enough to start fresh, to build something of his own, something that wasn't tied to her, to their past, or to the toxicity she had thrived on. The idea of rebuilding no longer scared him. It excited him. Meanwhile, his ex-wife disappeared from public view, retreating into silence after her disgrace. The social circles she once dominated had shut her out, unwilling to be associated with someone who had been publicly exposed as a fraud. The invitations stopped, the admiration turned to pity or scorn, and the life she had worked so hard to maintain crumbled. He heard through mutual acquaintances that she had sold their former home, downsizing to something far less extravagant. The irony wasn't lost on him. She had sought to strip him of everything, only to end up losing it all herself. But he didn't waste time thinking about her anymore. She was part of his past. And he was too busy looking forward. With each passing week, her life became quieter. The power she had wielded so effortlessly, the arrogance that had once defined her, had no place in the reality she now faced. Her new home was modest, a far cry from the luxury she had flaunted. The business world that had once admired her now treated her with caution, some outright distancing themselves, others quietly watching to see if she would recover from the scandal. But deep down, she knew her reputation was tarnished beyond repair. The empire she had built on deception had collapsed, and no one was interested in helping her rebuild. She tried, of course. She reached out to former allies, hoping for support, but most of them ignored her messages. Even those who had once called her a friend had no interest in aligning with someone whose credibility had been publicly shattered. There was no undoing what had happened. No amount of damage control could erase the court records, the headlines, the whispers that followed her everywhere she went. She had fought so hard to win, to destroy him, but in the end, she had only destroyed herself. And the worst part? He had moved on. He wasn't suffering. He wasn't broken. He was thriving. And that, more than anything, was her ultimate punishment. As he stood on the balcony of his new apartment, a peaceful silence surrounded him. It was a far cry from the house they had shared, a place that had once felt like a prison. Now, he was free. He had started a new job, one that gave him purpose, one that allowed him to build something meaningful on his own terms. He had reconnected with old friends, rebuilt relationships that had been strained by the toxicity of his marriage. Slowly, piece by piece, he was reclaiming the life he had nearly lost. And it felt better than he had ever imagined. His phone buzzed, a message from Daniel. "Drinks tonight? We're celebrating your new life, whether you like it or not." He chuckled, shaking his head. Once, he might have hesitated, might have let the weight of his past hold him back. But not anymore. He grabbed his jacket, ready to step out into the world as a man no longer defined by what had been taken from him. His ex-wife had wanted him to be nothing. Instead, he had become stronger, wiser, happier. And the best part? He didn't even need revenge. Watching her fall apart while he thrived was justice enough. And with that, he closed the door behind him, walking toward a future that was finally, truly his.